Fall asleep and stop chasing it. Neville Goddard. For the night you're tired of trying. Hook. There is an anomaly in the record Neville Goddard left behind, and it is the kind that is easy to walk straight past, because it is an absence rather than a presence. He published 12 books between 1939 and 1966. He began speaking publicly around 1938, and the recordings of his lectures run from about 1948 to 1971. That is more than 3 decades of one man explaining one method to audiences who kept coming back, and in all of that time, the instruction he gave never got any longer. It did not acquire stages, it did not grow a preparation phase, or a maintenance phase, or a list of things to be handled first. The vocabulary he was using at the end is the vocabulary he was using at the beginning. Almost nobody who teaches anything for 30 years leaves a record that flat, and the flatness is the single most useful thing about him for a person who is tired tonight. This video is about the few minutes before sleep that he cared about, and about the much larger question of what a person has been saying to themselves all day long before they ever get there. Section headings begin. The instruction that never got any longer. Take the anomaly seriously for a moment, because everything else in this video rests on it. Most teachers of anything accumulate. A method that starts simple picks up refinements, exceptions, warm-up routines, troubleshooting guides, and advanced tiers, partly because students demand them, and partly because a teacher, who has been asked the same question for 20 years, starts inventing new answers to stay interested. The material attributed to Neville Goddard today has certainly accumulated in exactly that way. There are now sequences with numbered steps, waiting periods, prescribed durations, checklists for whether an assumption has taken, and elaborate rules about what disqualifies an attempt. None of that accumulation happened in his own lifetime. What can be checked about him is checkable in a fairly narrow set of facts, and those facts do not support a growing method. The 12 books span 1939 to 1966. The active lecture period runs from about 1948 to 1971, and the terms he actually used, the ones that survive attached to his name with any reliability, are a short list that does not change across those years. Imagining creates reality. The wish fulfilled, the state akin to sleep, living in the end, the law of assumption, the mental diet, inner conversations, the bridge of incidents, revision, fourth-dimensional thinking. That list is the same list at the beginning and at the end. A man who was still saying those words in 1971 had been saying them since before the Second World War. He did not replace them, and he did not surround them with scaffolding. It is worth being precise about what kind of claim this is, because this channel would rather understate than oversell. This is not a claim built on a page reference. No primary text of his is being quoted in this video, and where a specific sentence of his is not verifiable in the surviving record, the teaching will be described rather than put in quotation marks and handed to him. The claim is a claim about shape. The shape of the record is a short vocabulary held steady across more than 3 decades of public teaching, describing a practice that happens in the ordinary minutes before a person falls asleep. And that shape is the answer to the question the title of this video asks. If a person is tired of trying, the obvious explanation is that they have been doing too much of something. Goddard's record suggests something less obvious and less flattering. The tiredness does not come from the doing. It comes from a conversation that never stops. Who Neville Goddard was before any of this? Neville Lancelot Goddard was born on the 19th of February 1905 in St. Michael, Barbados, one of 9 children in a merchant family. He left for New York City in 1922, at 17, and he did not go to teach anything or to look for a philosophy. He went to work, and the work was the stage. He was a dancer. What is worth noticing about the biography is not the exotic part but the ordinary part, and the ordinary part is the duration. He arrived in New York in 1922. His first book did not appear until 1939. The recordings that carry most of his surviving lecture material do not begin until around 1948. He was 43 years old before anyone was reliably capturing his voice. Between the boat and the first book, there are 17 years in which he was a working performer in a city that was, for most of that stretch, in a severe economic depression, and in which he married, separated, had a child, married again, and had another. He married Mildred Mary Hughes in 1923, and they separated. His son Joseph was born in 1924. He married Catherine Van Schumas in 1938, and their daughter Victoria followed. Somewhere across the 1920s and 1930s, in New York, he met the teacher he only ever named as Abdullah, a black mystic often described in later accounts as an Ethiopian rabbi, although the actual origins are debated, and this video is not going to pretend they are settled. Abdullah taught him Hebrew and scripture and a way of reading it. He died on the 1st of October, 1972, in Los Angeles. The lecture cities on the documented record are New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, and occasional returns to the island where he was born. That is the whole biography that can be stood behind, and it matters here for one reason. The man giving instructions about the last minutes before sleep was not a monk, not an heir, not a clergyman with an institution paying his rent, and not somebody who had been insulated from ordinary financial fear. He was a working performer with a family and a mortgage on his attention, teaching in the evenings, in rented halls, to people who had come after their own working day. Whatever the material is, it was built by somebody living the same shape of life as the person listening to it. What Goddard meant by the word faith. This section comes third rather than 23rd, and the placement is deliberate. The title of this video is going to attract two kinds of listener. One of them wants a method. The other one hears the register of the title, hears something restful and permission-granting in it, and arrives expecting a devotional instruction. That second reading has to be corrected before anything is built on top of it, or the rest of the video quietly becomes a different teaching wearing Goddard's name. When Goddard used religious language, and he used it constantly, he was not pointing at a separate being located elsewhere who reviews requests, weighs merit, and disperses outcomes to the deserving. In the lectures of his later years, he stated his position about as plainly as it can be stated. God, in his account, is a person's own wonderful human imagination. That is not a metaphor he reached for occasionally. It is the load-bearing definition, and it changes the meaning of every religious word he used afterwards. So faith, in his usage, is not confidence in an external provider. It is not the intensity of a wish, and it is not how badly a person wants something. Faith is the condition of a person who is treating an unseen state as the real one. That is a technical description, not an emotional one, and it is testable in a way that emotional definitions are not. A person can check whether they are treating a state as real by noticing what they say to themselves when nobody is listening. His second book, published in 1941, is called Your Faith is Your Fortune. The title is a complete argument in 4 words, and it is the reason this video reaches for that book rather than the more famous ones. It does not say your effort is your fortune. It does not say your desire is your fortune, or your discipline, or your deserving. It puts the whole weight on faith, which he had already redefined as the state a person is actually occupying. Two further things should be said, and then this section can close. Goddard endorsed no denomination, and nothing in this video is an argument for or against any church. And he did use scriptural phrases directly. Christ in you, the hope of glory, is one he returned to. He also had a term of his own, the promise, for the mystical experience he taught in his later years, and a related term, the anointed one. Those belong to him, and they will come back later in this video, handled carefully, because the faith side of this material is where the most confident nonsense currently circulates. What the word imagination meant to him. One more definition has to be fixed before the practical material, because the word carrying the most weight in his entire vocabulary is the word most likely to be heard wrongly by anybody hearing it in the present century. Goddard's central statement is that imagining creates reality. In ordinary modern usage, imagination means the faculty of entertaining things that are not so. It is the word for daydreams, for fiction, for the pleasant unreal. To say a thing is imaginary is to say it does not exist, and a person who is told that their imagination creates their reality will hear, quite reasonably, that they are being asked to pretend. That is not the usage he inherited or the usage he taught. In his account, imagination is not the faculty of the unreal. It is the faculty by which anything becomes real at all, and it occupies the position that other systems assign to God, which is precisely why he was willing to use the two words interchangeably in his later lectures. The practical consequence is a change in what a person thinks they are doing during the practice. Under the ordinary usage, imagining a settled outcome is a kind of consoling fiction, performed in full knowledge that it is not the case, and consoling fiction is tiring to maintain because part of the mind is always holding the truth in reserve. Under his usage, there is nothing being held in reserve, because the imagined state is not being classified as unreal in the first place. This is also the cleanest way to see why pretending is not the same act. Pretending requires a person to keep two things in view at once, the pretense and the fact, and the effort of keeping both in view is the entire cost of it. What he described has only one thing in view. That is not a stronger version of pretending. It is a different operation with a different price, and the price is what a tired person is entitled to care about. The word is doing a great deal of work, and it is worth carrying the corrected version of it through the rest of this video. The tiredness that comes from talking to yourself. Here is the claim this video is actually going to defend. A person who is exhausted by trying is usually not exhausted by their actions. They are exhausted by an inner conversation that has been running underneath the actions all day, and which does not stop when the actions do. Consider what the trying actually consists of. Very little of it is physical. A person who is chasing something spends perhaps an hour of a given day doing anything about it that another person could observe. The rest of the day is interior. It is checking. It is rehearsing what might go wrong and drafting the reply to it. It is auditing the current circumstances for evidence of progress and finding none. It is a running commentary in which the current state is named, and named again, and named a third time, in words that would be considered rude if anyone said them out loud to somebody else. That interior traffic is not incidental to the trying. On Goddard's account, it is the trying. And it has a specific cost that physical effort does not have, which is that it never has an end point. Physical work finishes. A person puts the tools down. The inner conversation has no tools to put down, and no shift that ends, which is why a person can spend a day accomplishing nothing visible and go to bed genuinely and completely tired. This is where the title of this video comes from, and it should be said clearly that the title is a modern phrasing, not a sentence of Goddard's. He did not write fall asleep and stop chasing it. What he did teach, consistently, across the whole span of the record, is that the last few minutes before sleep are the point at which the interior traffic can actually be interrupted, and that the interruption is the whole of a person's creative work. Everything else in his system is downstream of that. So the question this video keeps returning to is not how hard a person is working. It is a narrower and more uncomfortable question. What has this person been saying to themselves in the flat, unremarkable voice nobody else hears about the thing they want? Because Goddard's position was that the answer to that question is not a symptom of their circumstances. It is the mechanism producing them. The mental diet, named and dated. Goddard had a name for the discipline that answers that question, and the name is unusually plain for a man who was often accused of mysticism. He called it the mental diet. The metaphor is doing exact work and is worth unpacking slowly, because the modern versions of it have been softened into something much vaguer. A diet is not a mood. A diet is not enthusiasm about food. A diet is a specific and slightly tedious account of what actually went in, measured in ordinary units, over a period long enough for the result to show. Nobody credits a diet with working because a person felt strongly about it on a Tuesday. It works or fails on the boring, accumulated total. He applied that structure to thought, and specifically to inner speech. The material a person consumes mentally is, in his account, not a matter of what they believe in the abstract, or what they would tell an interviewer they believe. It is the accumulated total of the sentences they actually run, in the ordinary minutes, about themselves and their situation. And the accounting is unforgiving, in the same way a food diary is unforgiving. The 3 deliberate minutes of positive intent in the morning are on the ledger, and so are the 400 small sentences of contradiction that follow them. A note about sourcing is owed here, and this channel would rather give it than skip it. The phrase mental diet is genuinely his, and sits on the verified list of terms he used. The book of his that carries the same idea in its title is Seed Time and Harvest, published in 1956, whose whole metaphor is that what is sown is what comes up, on a delay, without editorial discretion at the moment of harvest. This video is describing the discipline rather than quoting a page of it, because no verifiable passage is being put in front of you, and it would be dishonest to invent the appearance of one. What the metaphor makes obvious is why a person can practice faithfully at night and see nothing. If the accounting is a total, then a strong 10 minutes against 16 weak hours is a losing arithmetic, and no amount of sincerity during the 10 minutes changes the sum. This is not a moral failure, and Goddard did not treat it as one. It is a measurement problem, and measurement problems are fixed by looking at the whole intake rather than by trying harder during the part that already goes well. Inner conversations, and the ones you did not choose. Inner conversations is the second of his terms, and it is more specific than the mental diet. The diet describes the total. Inner conversations describe the actual units the total is made of. Most people, asked what they think about all day, will describe images or moods. Goddard's attention went somewhere more particular. He was interested in the fact that human interior life is largely conducted as speech, and usually as dialogue rather than as monologue. A person does not simply think about a difficult colleague. They rehearse a conversation with that colleague, supply the colleague's lines, take offense at the lines they themselves supplied, and draft a response. A person does not simply worry about money. They conduct an argument with an imagined figure who is doubting them, or explaining the situation to a relative, or apologizing to someone. That observation is the practical core of his teaching, and it is also the most testable thing in it. Anyone can check it inside a day. The check is simply to notice once an hour, who is being spoken to and what is being said. What the check tends to reveal is the part Goddard cared about. Almost none of that dialogue was chosen. It arrived. It runs on a template established years ago. It repeats with very little variation, and it is nearly always conducted from the position of the current state rather than the wanted one. The person in the imagined conversation is explaining, defending, justifying, or apologizing, and every one of those postures assumes the thing has not happened yet. Goddard's instruction follows directly and is not complicated. If interior life is conducted as dialogue, then the dialogue is the material, and the question is not whether a person is having inner conversations, because everybody is, all the time. The question is whether the conversations they are having are the ones a person would have if the thing they wanted had already occurred. That is an enormous difference in outcome, produced by an almost invisible difference in practice. A person who is chasing something conducts conversations in which the thing is still missing. A person who has assumed it conducts conversations in which it is settled and no longer the subject. The words are different, the tone is different, and above all, the amount of energy required is different, which is the part that matters for anyone listening to this at the end of a long day. Your faith is your fortune and its central claim. Return to the 1941 book, because it is the one that carries the faith side of this material without any of the later mystical apparatus attached to it. Your Faith is Your Fortune arrived 2 years after his first book. It is early Goddard, written before the recordings, before the large Los Angeles audiences, and before the later phase in which the mystical experience he called the promise became the center of what he taught. What it states, in its title alone, is a claim about causation that ought to be examined rather than nodded at. The ordinary reading of a phrase like that is inspirational and harmless. Believe in yourself and things will go well. That reading is not his, and it is worth separating out, because it is the reading that leaves a tired person with nothing to do except manufacture more enthusiasm, which is exactly the manufacturing that has worn them out. His claim is structural. Faith, as he had defined it, is the state a person is actually occupying, as distinct from the state they say they prefer. Fortune, in his usage, is not restricted to money and is closer to the sum of what shows up. The sentence therefore reads as an identity rather than an encouragement. What a person is actually occupying is what actually arrives, not what they hope for, not what they work towards, what they occupy. This has an immediate and slightly brutal consequence for anyone who feels they have done everything right and received nothing. If the arriving fortune is the occupied faith, then the arriving fortune is diagnostic. It is a readout, not a verdict, and it reports on the state that has actually been held rather than on the state that has been declared during the good 10 minutes. There is a version of this that becomes cruel, and it should be named and refused. The cruel version says that anybody in difficulty has caused their difficulty and should feel accordingly. Nothing in the surviving record supports using the teaching that way, and the honest position is narrower. His teaching is a claim about what a person can change from where they stand, addressed to the person themselves and to nobody else. It was never offered as an instrument for explaining other people's misfortunes to them, and a listener who is tired tonight is entitled to hear that distinction stated plainly rather than left implied. Chasing as a form of inner speech. The word chasing appears in this video's title, and it is worth defining it in Goddard's own terms rather than in the ordinary ones, because the ordinary meaning sends a tired person in precisely the wrong direction. Ordinarily, chasing means activity. It means applications sent, calls made, hours put in, distance covered. Understood that way, The instruction to stop chasing is either useless advice or actively harmful advice, and a great deal of material circulating under Goddard's name reads exactly as though it were telling people to withdraw from their own lives and wait. He was not describing activity. On his account, chasing is a posture, and the posture is legible in inner speech long before it is legible in anyone's calendar. A person who is chasing something is conducting an interior commentary in which the thing is not here. Every sentence in that commentary, however hopeful its content, restates the absence. I want it. I need it soon. It has not come. Maybe next month. I am doing everything I can. Each of those sentences is a small formal declaration that the wanted state is not the occupied state, and on Goddard's account, the declaration is the operative fact. This produces a distinction that resolves the apparent paradox in the title. Two people can perform identical actions all week. One of them is chasing, and the other is not. The difference is not in the actions, and is not visible from the outside. It is in what each of them is saying interiorly while performing them. The first is filing an application while narrating a story in which they are the person who does not have the job. The second is filing the same application while occupying the state of a person for whom the matter is already settled, doing the ordinary next thing that such a person would do. Nothing in the surviving record suggests Goddard asked anybody to stop working, stop planning, or stop attending to their own affairs. What he asked them to stop was the interior narration of absence that most people run underneath their activity without ever noticing that they are running it. That is what is exhausting. The actions were never the problem. 14 hours of restating a lack is the problem, and it is available to be stopped tonight in a way that a person's obligations are not. The difference between effort and attention. There is a distinction hiding underneath everything above, and it deserves its own section, because getting it wrong is the most common way this material gets misapplied. Effort and attention are not the same resource, and they do not deplete in the same way. Effort is the application of force to a task, and it is genuinely limited, and it recovers with rest. Attention is what a person is currently treating as real, and it is not limited in that way at all. Attention is always fully deployed. There is no state in which a person is not attending to something. The only question available is what? Almost every instruction in the popular manifestation literature is an instruction about effort. Do the practice for longer. Do it more times a day. Concentrate harder. Persist through the resistance. Those are all instructions to apply more force, and every one of them makes a tired listener tireder, which is the reverse of what the material is supposed to do. Goddard's instruction, as far as the record supports, is an instruction about attention. It is not asking for more force. It is asking that the attention which is being spent anyway, in enormous quantity, on rehearsal and audit and interior argument, be spent on a different object. That is a redirection, not an addition, and the arithmetic of it is completely different. A person who redirects attention does not do more. In the ordinary sense, they do considerably less. This is why the practice never got any longer across the whole span of the record. A technique that runs on effort has to escalate, because effort produces diminishing returns, and students always ask for more of what appeared to work. A technique that runs on redirected attention has no reason to escalate, because there is no dose to increase. It either has the attention or it does not. And 10 quiet minutes that genuinely have it are not improved by becoming 30. Something practical follows for a person who is listening to this at the end of a hard day. If the instruction feels like one more demand on an already emptied account, it has been misunderstood, and the misunderstanding is almost certainly the effort reading. Nothing in this material requires a person to summon anything. It requires them to stop supplying something, which is a thing an exhausted person is actually capable of doing, and often the only thing they are capable of doing. An assumption persisted and hardens into fact. The sentence most reliably associated with him, and the one closest to a formal statement of his mechanism, is that an assumption, though false, if persisted in, will harden into fact. It is worth taking the sentence apart word by word, because it is quoted constantly and read carelessly, and the careless reading is the one that produces the exhaustion this video is about. Assumption, not wish, not hope, not goal, not intention. An assumption is what a person takes to be already the case, and it is characterized by what it stops rather than by what it starts. A person who assumes it is Tuesday does not verify that it is Tuesday. They act from it. The word is chosen precisely, and it is the reason he called the whole thing the law of assumption. Though false. This is the clause that gets edited out, and it is the most generous clause in the sentence. He is saying explicitly that the assumption does not have to be true at the moment it is made. It does not have to be plausible. It does not have to be supported by any current evidence. That removes at a stroke the entire burden of making oneself believe something, which is the burden most people carry into this material and the one that breaks them, if persisted in. Here is the actual condition, and it is the condition his whole mental diet discipline exists to serve. Persistence, in his sense, is not intensity, and it is not repetition on a schedule. It is continuity. It means the assumption is not abandoned between practices, which is not the same as thinking about it constantly. A person who assumes they are employed does not think about being employed all day. They simply never at any point that day narrate themselves as unemployed. Will harden into fact. A slow physical metaphor rather than a magical one. Hardening takes time, happens without supervision, and cannot be hurried by checking on it. Concrete does not set faster because somebody stands over it. Read that way, the sentence is not a demand for belief and not a demand for effort. It is a description of a process with exactly one requirement, which is that a person stop actively undoing it in the hours between attempts. That is the whole of the discipline, and it is why the record never needed anything more elaborate. Why repetition was never the mechanism. Here is a correction that is overdue on this subject, and that almost never gets made, and it matters more than usual to anyone listening to this because they are tired. An enormous amount of material circulating under Goddard's name instructs people to repeat things. Repeat a phrase a set number of times. Say it in the mirror. Write it out morning and night. Loop a recording of it while sleeping. The stated theory is always that repetition wears a groove, and that the mind eventually accepts what it has heard often enough. That theory is not his. On the verified record, Goddard was ambivalent about affirmations, and what he focused on instead was the assumed feeling of the state, not the frequency of a sentence. The distinction is not a technicality. It is the difference between a practice that gets heavier every week and a practice that does not. Consider what repetition actually implies. If the mechanism is frequency, then more is always better. A missed day is a real loss, and the practice is an obligation that grows. It also has a structural defect that anybody who has tried it will recognize. Repeating a statement of something a person does not have keeps the absence in continuous view. 200 repetitions of a sentence about wanting is 200 fresh restatements of not having. On his own account of inner speech, that is a mental diet made entirely of the wrong food, consumed with great discipline. The related error travels under the phrase, fake it till you make it, and that is not his either. Pretending is not assumption. Pretending has a pretender in it, someone who knows better and is performing anyway, and the knowing better is itself a continuous inner statement of the actual position. Assumption in his sense contains no performer. It is closer to what a person does about their own name, which they do not affirm, rehearse, or defend, and which requires no maintenance at all. So the practical correction is this. If somebody has been counting repetitions and feeling the count grow heavier, they have not been failing at his method. They have been succeeding at a different method that was attached to his name later. The thing he actually described takes no count, has no minimum, and cannot be fallen behind on. The Power of Awareness and the Word Assumption. The book that carries the mechanism most directly is The Power of Awareness, published in 1952, and its title is another four-word argument worth slowing down over. Awareness. Not effort, not visualization, not will. Awareness is simply what a person is conscious of being, and the claim in the title is that this, and not anything more strenuous, is where the power sits. By 1952, Goddard had been teaching publicly for around 14 years and had been recorded for 4. This is mid-period work, written after he knew from a large number of audiences which parts of the teaching people reliably got wrong. And the correction embedded in the title is aimed at the most common error, which is the assumption that the power lies in the intensity of the imagining rather than in what a person is aware of being while they imagine. The distinction is easiest to see through the word assumption itself, taken in its ordinary sense. Everybody carries thousands of assumptions, and none of them require any energy. A person assumes the floor will hold. They assume their name is their name. They assume the language they are about to speak will be understood. Those assumptions are not affirmed, defended, or topped up. They are simply the ground from which everything else is done, and they are completely invisible to the person holding them until somebody points at one. Goddard's entire technique is an attempt to install a chosen assumption into that same category, and this is why he was so insistent that the practice happens at the edge of sleep rather than in the alert middle of the day. An alert mind holds a new assumption at arm's length, examines it, compares it against the evidence, and files it under things I would like to be true. That filing is the failure. The assumption has been received as a proposal rather than as a fact, and a proposal generates exactly the interior argument that the mental diet is trying to end. The Power of Awareness, in that reading, is not a claim about the strength of the mind. It is a claim about the difference between a thought a person is examining and a state a person is simply in. The first costs energy continuously. The second costs nothing at all, which is once again the point that matters most for anybody who is listening to this, because they are worn out. The wish fulfilled and what feeling actually means. His term for the object of the practice is the wish fulfilled, and the phrase is exact in a way that rewards attention. It is not the wish, it is the wish fulfilled, which is a different thing entirely and is the only thing he ever asked anybody to occupy. A wish, held as a wish, is a statement of distance. The wish fulfilled has no distance in it, because a fulfilled wish is simply a fact that a person has stopped thinking about. That is the odd quality of the target state and the reason it is so often missed. The correct endpoint of the practice is not excitement. It is the particular flatness of something already handled. The associated instruction is about feeling, and his 1944 book is titled, Feeling is the Secret, so the emphasis is not in dispute even where the pages are not being quoted here. But feeling, in his sense, is easily misheard as emotion, and misheard that way it becomes another thing to manufacture. A person who believes they must generate strong emotion nightly has been handed a demand they cannot reliably meet, particularly on the nights when they are tired, which are the nights they most need something workable. Feeling in his usage is closer to sensation than to emotion, and closer still to the ordinary sense of what a situation is like from the inside. It is what a person notices without trying when they are somewhere. The temperature of a room, the weight of a thing in a hand, the specific quality of relief that follows a matter being closed. None of that is generated. It is registered, which sets the actual standard for the night practice, and the standard is much lower than most people assume. The scene does not have to be vivid, detailed, cinematic, or emotionally overwhelming. It has to be occupied. A dull, dim, half-formed scene that a person is genuinely inside is doing the work. A brilliant, detailed scene that a person is watching from outside like a film is not, however impressive it looks. Thinking from the end rather than toward it. Goddard had a phrase for the shift just described, and it is the one that sounds most obscure and is actually the most concrete thing in his vocabulary. He called it fourth-dimensional thinking. Set the name aside for a moment, because it is doing the material no favors in the present century. What it describes is a change in the position a person occupies while thinking about a wanted thing. There are only two available positions, and the difference between them is the whole teaching. The first position is the ordinary one. A person stands in their current situation and looks forward at the thing they want. From there, the thing is at a distance. The distance has to be crossed. The crossing requires a route, and the route has to be figured out. Everything about that position generates work. It generates planning, calculation, contingency, anxiety about the gap, and a running interior commentary about whether progress is being made. It is, precisely, the position of chasing. The second position is the one he asked for. A person occupies the finished state and looks back from it. From there, the thing is not at a distance, there is no gap to be crossed, and the route is not a problem to be solved because it has, from that vantage point, already happened. The practical test between the two positions is small and completely reliable. It is a question of grammar. From the first position, a person's inner sentences are in the future, or the conditional. When this happens, if this works out, I hope, I am trying. From the second position, the sentences are in the past or the settled present. That is handled, that is done. The relief in the second set of sentences is not manufactured. It is a property of the position itself. This is why he tied it to a specific mental posture, rather than to a technique. Nobody can think from the end and simultaneously monitor the distance to the end, because the two require incompatible positions. And the monitoring is where the fatigue comes from. A person can genuinely rest in the second position, which is not something that can be said about any amount of visualizing done from the first. The threshold between waking and sleeping. Everything so far has described a posture. This section describes when he said to take it, and the answer is the most specific instruction in his entire body of work. He called it the state akin to sleep. It is not sleep, and it is not meditation in the sense that word usually carries now. It is the narrow interval a person passes through every single night on the way from being awake to being asleep. The drowsy stretch in which thinking has gone loose, the body has stopped being reported on, and the ordinary supervising attention has largely stood down but has not gone. Three things are true of that interval, and each of them is doing work in his system. The first is that it is universal and free. Every person on earth passes through it nightly without arranging anything. It requires no instruction, no posture, no equipment, no quiet room. and no ability whatsoever. It is not a skill that some people have and others lack. The second is that the critical faculty is not operating in it. In the alert middle of the day, a chosen statement is met immediately by an internal auditor who compares it against the evidence and rejects it. In the drowsy interval, that auditor has already clocked off. A statement made there is not argued with. It is simply taken in, which is the entire reason he cared about the interval at all. The third is that it is very short, and it cannot be extended by trying. A person who works at entering it stays awake. A person who monitors whether they have entered it has, by monitoring, left it. This is the one place in the material where trying is not merely unhelpful, but structurally self-defeating, and it is a reasonable summary of why he built the practice around a moment nobody has to produce. What he asked to be carried into that interval is not a phrase, a count, or a visualization performed to a standard. It is a single short scene or a single short sentence implying the wish already fulfilled, held loosely, allowed to repeat itself the way a tune repeats itself when a person is half asleep and then abandoned to sleep. That is the whole of it, and it is worth noticing how completely it fails to be a discipline in the modern sense. Why he placed the practice at night. There is a second reason for the nightly placement that is easy to miss and that speaks directly to a person who is tired of trying, and it is about what the practice replaces rather than what it adds. Nobody arrives at sleep with an empty mind. The interval before sleep is already occupied, every night, in almost every adult life, and what occupies it is remarkably consistent. It is the review. The day gets replayed with commentary. Unfinished obligations are counted. Conversations that went badly are rerun with better lines supplied. The financial position is checked over one more time. Tomorrow is rehearsed in outline. And then, frequently, the whole cycle runs again. That review is not a neutral activity on Goddard's account. It is the most consequential inner conversation of the entire day, because it happens in exactly the interval where the critical faculty has stood down and material is taken in without argument. A person conducting an anxious audit at the edge of sleep is not simply failing to practice. They are practicing the opposite, nightly, with excellent consistency, in the most receptive state they will occupy all day. Which reframes what is being asked. He is not asking a person to add 10 minutes of work to a full day. He is asking them to change the content of 10 minutes that are already being spent and that are currently being spent on the single most expensive interior activity available to them. This also explains the strange arithmetic of people who practice and see nothing. A person can hold a chosen assumption faithfully for a week, and then lie awake on the 8th night, conducting a full inventory of everything that has not yet changed. And on his own account of the mental diet, the inventory is the meal that counts, because of when it was eaten. Nothing about this requires optimism, and it should be said clearly that optimism is not being prescribed here. A person can be flat, unconvinced, and thoroughly tired, and still decline to run the review. Declining is not a positive act requiring energy. It is the withholding of an act, and the thing that fills the space afterwards does not have to be impressive. It has to be short, it has to imply the thing is already settled, and it has to be allowed to go quiet. Faith as loyalty rather than intensity. Come back to faith, now that the mechanism has been described, because the word can be given a much more exact meaning than it was given earlier, and the exactness is a relief. The popular meaning of faith is a quantity. People speak of having enough faith, of losing faith, of faith wavering, as though it were a fuel level that has to be maintained and that runs down under pressure. Anyone who has tried to operate that way knows what it costs. It means that every honest moment of doubt is a leak, that the leak has to be plugged with more conviction, and that conviction has to be generated from somewhere. That is an exhausting model, and it is the model that most often gets attached to this material. The meaning available in Goddard's usage is not a quantity. It is closer to loyalty. Loyalty is not a feeling, and it does not fluctuate with mood. A person can be entirely loyal to somebody while being irritated with them, unimpressed by them, and privately doubtful about a decision they have made. Loyalty is not measured by warmth. It is measured by what a person does not do. Faith in that sense is a matter of what a person declines to reopen. The assumption was made. It is not being re-examined at every provocation, not because the person feels certain, but because reopening it is simply not on the list of things they do. Doubt may arrive. Doubt arriving is not a breach of loyalty. Conducting a full relitigation of the case every time doubt arrives is. This distinction rescues a great many people who conclude they are constitutionally incapable of this material because they cannot make themselves feel sure. Feeling sure was never the requirement. The record supports something much smaller and much more achievable, which is that a person keeps returning to the same assumption rather than replacing it with a new one every time the evidence looks unpromising. And it puts the earlier clause about a false assumption into its proper place. He explicitly allowed that the assumption is false at the moment of making it. A person who insists on feeling certain has quietly reintroduced a requirement that he removed on purpose, and has then blamed themselves for failing a test that was never set. How he handled Scripture without a denomination. The faith material needs one more careful section, because this is where the most confident and least supportable claims about him circulate, and a listener deserves to know where the solid ground stops. What can be stated firmly is this. Goddard drew heavily on biblical language and biblical interpretation, and he endorsed no specific denomination. Both halves matter. A person who takes him for a Christian teacher, in the ordinary institutional sense, has him wrong, and so does a person who takes him for someone hostile to Scripture. He used scriptural phrases as instruments rather than as citations of authority. Christ in you, the hope of glory, is a phrase he returned to, and the emphasis he placed on the word in is the whole of his interpretive position in a single preposition. He was not pointing at a figure a person should look towards. He was pointing at something located where the person already stands, which is entirely consistent with his statement that God is a person's own wonderful human imagination. This produces a genuinely unusual position, and it is worth stating rather than smoothing over. He was not offering an alternative to religion, and he was not offering a version of it. He was reading the same texts as an account of what happens inside a person, and he taught that reading for more than 30 years to audiences who mostly came from ordinary religious backgrounds and who evidently did not experience it as an attack on them. For the purposes of this video, one consequence matters above the others. Nothing in his material asks a listener to petition. There is no request being submitted anywhere, no case being made for why the request deserves approval, and no waiting for a decision from an authority that might decline. That whole structure, which is the one most people bring to the word faith, is absent, and its absence is the reason this teaching can be described as restful without the description being a marketing claim. If a listener holds a religious commitment of their own, nothing here requires them to trade it for his. What is being reported is what he taught, in his own terms, with the limits of the record marked. What a person does with it afterwards was never his department, and is not this channel's either. Freedom for All and the Question of Permission. The 1942 book carries a word in its title that is worth pausing on in a video about exhaustion, because the exhaustion very often has a component nobody names. Freedom for All arrived third, a year after Your Faith is Your Fortune, and its title makes a claim about scope rather than about method. Not freedom for the initiated, not freedom for those who have studied long enough, not freedom for the people who have earned it. For all. That scope claim answers a question most people never quite ask out loud, which is whether they are permitted. A great deal of the interior traffic this video has been describing is not really about routes or timelines at all. It is about eligibility. Whether a person of this background, with this history, at this age, having made these particular mistakes, is the kind of person to whom the thing in question happens. That question runs quietly underneath the practical worrying, and it is far more tiring than the practical worrying, because it has no possible answer and therefore never closes. Nothing in the surviving record suggests Goddard operated any kind of qualification. He taught in rented halls to whoever paid to sit down. He was not attached to an institution that could confer standing on anybody, and the framework he described has no place in it where merit could be assessed. A state is occupied, or it is not. There is no assessor and no application, which was already established when the petition model was set aside earlier in this video. And it applies just as much to the question of whether a person deserves the thing as to the question of how it will arrive. For somebody listening at the end of a long day, that is the more useful half of the teaching, and it costs nothing to test. The next time the interior commentary begins, notice whether it is actually about a route, or whether it is about permission wearing a route as a disguise. What Goddard divided into law and promise. There is a division running through his work that has to be explained here, partly because it is genuinely his, and partly because ignoring it is how this material gets misrepresented in both directions. He taught two things, and he did not treat them as the same thing. The first he called the law. That is everything this video has been describing. The mechanism of assumption, the state akin to sleep, the mental diet, the whole practical apparatus by which a person changes their circumstances. The second he called the promise, and he had a related term for what it concerns, the anointed one. The promise refers to the mystical experience he taught in his later years, which he described as something that happens to a person rather than something they produce, and which is not about circumstances at all. The 1961 book that names both is called The Law and the Promise, and the conjunction in that title is the entire point. Two subjects, in one book, deliberately kept distinct. The reason to raise this in a video about being tired of trying is that the division protects the listener from two opposite errors. The first error is to take the law for the whole of him. That produces the picture of Goddard as a technique vendor, a man with a method for acquiring things, which flattens 30 years of work into a life hack and is not what he spent his later period teaching. The second error runs the other way, and it is the one that matters more tonight. It is to hear the mystical vocabulary, conclude that the material is only available to people who have had some kind of experience, and therefore that a tired person with a practical problem has no business here. That conclusion does not follow from his own arrangement of the subjects. He taught the law openly, to general audiences, as something operable by anybody, and he was still doing so in the same years he was teaching the promise. What is honestly not available here is any account of the promise, beyond the fact that he taught it, named it, and treated it as a separate category. The surviving record that this channel can stand behind supports the existence and the naming of the distinction. It does not support a confident description of an inner experience of a man who died in 1972, and one will not be supplied. Assumption is not attraction, and why it matters. The single most common thing said about Neville Goddard is wrong, and correcting it is not pedantry, because the wrong version and the right version prescribe opposite behavior. He is routinely described as a teacher of the law of attraction. He did not use that phrase, and it is not his teaching. His term was the law of assumption, and the difference between the two is mechanical rather than cosmetic. Attraction is a magnetic model. It imagines the wanted thing as an object at a distance, and imagines the person as something that emits a quality which draws that object closer. Everything about that picture implies distance, transit, and monitoring. The thing is over there. It is on its way. The person's job is to keep emitting, and, inevitably, to keep checking how close it has got. Assumption is not a model of attraction at all. It has no distance in it, and nothing travels. The claim is that a person occupies a state, and that circumstances are the outward expression of the state occupied. There is nothing to attract, because nothing is elsewhere, and there is nothing to monitor, because there is no transit to observe. The behavioral consequences separate immediately. Under a magnetic model, checking is natural and almost obligatory, since a person would reasonably want to know whether the pull is working. Under an assumption model, checking is the failure itself, because the act of looking to see whether a state has produced its evidence is an act performed from the position of not yet having it, and that position is the thing being changed. This is why the mislabeling is worth this much time. A person who has absorbed the attraction version has been given a practice that includes a monitoring step. They will keep looking, and every look will restate the absence, and the restatement will read to them as diligence. They will then be told, when it does not work, that they did not want it enough, or did not emit strongly enough, and the prescribed remedy will be more of the very thing that is costing them. For the sake of the record, and since this channel has now said it in several videos, and will keep saying it, the law of attraction is not Goddard's phrase, was not his framework, and is not what this material teaches. The claim that trying harder speeds it up. There is a related claim that deserves its own examination, because it is the claim most likely to be running in the mind of somebody who has arrived at this video exhausted. The claim is that results scale with effort, and that a disappointing result therefore indicates insufficient effort. It is so deeply installed in ordinary life that it does not usually get noticed as a claim at all. It is simply how a person understands the relationship between what they put in and what they get out, and it is true across an enormous range of human activity. It is true of learning an instrument, true of physical training, true of most kinds of work. It is not true here, and Goddard's position on the point is one of the few things that can be stated without qualification, since it appears on the verified record as a thing he specifically did not teach. He did not teach that a person should hustle and work hard for what they want. His teaching is rest in the assumption. That is close to the opposite instruction. The reason is not that effort is morally suspect. It is that the mechanism does not have an input that effort can be applied to. The mechanism runs on the state a person occupies, and states are not intensified by force. A person cannot occupy a state more. They occupy it or they occupy a different one. Applying more force to the practice does not deepen the occupation. What it actually does is introduce a supervisor who is monitoring the quality of the occupation, and a supervised state is a state being examined from outside, which is the other position entirely. This is the mechanical explanation for something almost everyone reports. The thing that arrives usually arrives after the person stops working on it, often during a period they would describe as having given up. The popular explanation for that pattern is that letting go releases something. The explanation available in Goddard's terms is duller and more precise. Giving up on a wanted thing frequently means giving up the interior monitoring of it, and the monitoring was the only thing preventing the assumption from settling. Nothing about that says a person should stop acting in the world. It says that the acting was never the variable, and that treating it as the variable is what produces the specific tiredness the title of this video names. Nothing in the record promises a date. Somebody who has followed the argument this far will want to know how long it takes. And this section exists to say plainly that the honest answer is that nobody knows and that the surviving record does not contain a schedule. That answer is unsatisfying, and it is going to be less satisfying than what is available elsewhere. There is a great deal of material circulating that supplies confident timelines, numbers of days, numbers of nights, rules about how long an assumption takes to set. None of that is traceable to anything Goddard verifiably taught, and this channel is not going to supply invented precision, because precision is what a listener wants at the end of a hard day. What the record does support is a structure rather than a duration, and the structure is contained in the harvest metaphor he chose. Sowing and harvest are separated by an interval. The interval is not optional, it is not a sign of failure, and its length is not under the control of the person who did the sowing. A farmer who digs up a seed to inspect its progress does not learn anything useful and does considerable harm, and the metaphor is chosen well enough that the analogy does not need to be spelled out. He also had a term for what happens during the interval, and it is one of the more useful ones. He called it the bridge of incidents. The claim is that the passage from the assumed state to its visible arrival is not a single event, but a sequence of ordinary occurrences, each of which looks like nothing at the time. A conversation that goes slightly differently, a plan that falls through and frees a week, a person who mentions something in passing. The bridge is built out of material that is, by design, unremarkable while it is being crossed, which produces a genuinely awkward consequence for anybody looking for evidence. Progress across the bridge is not visible as progress. It looks like an ordinary week in which nothing happened. A person auditing their circumstances for signs will therefore find none, will conclude the thing is not working, and will restore the interior commentary of absence, which on his account is the one action that actually interrupts the process. The only honest instruction available here is the one that is hardest to hear when a person is tired. There is no way to tell how far along it is, and the attempt to tell is itself expensive. Where the means come from and why it looks ordinary. The bridge of incidents deserves a fuller treatment than the previous section could give it, because the question of how the thing is supposed to arrive is the question that most often defeats a person who otherwise understands everything. The difficulty is not really about belief. It is that a person can hold an assumption sincerely and still, involuntarily, keep running the route. They lie down at night, take the finished state, and within 90 seconds their mind has begun the calculation. But how? Through whom? Which of the four possibilities is it going to be? And once that calculation begins, the position has already shifted back to the ordinary one, standing in the present and looking forward across a gap. Goddard's account of why the calculation is a mistake is not mystical and does not require anything to be taken on trust. A person calculating a route can only build it out of what they currently know. They can only route through the contacts they have, the openings they are aware of, and the mechanisms they have already seen work. That is a small set. It is, necessarily, the set that has not so far produced the result, since if it had, the person would not be lying awake about it. So the calculation is not merely unnecessary on his account. It is restrictive. It confines the arriving thing to a set of channels that have already been demonstrated insufficient, and it does so while consuming the attention that the practice requires. What follows is a genuinely counterintuitive instruction, and it should be stated in its ordinary form rather than dressed up. The route is not the practitioner's material. The finished state is, and the finished state can be occupied in complete ignorance of how it came about, which is in fact the ordinary human condition regarding most of what has already happened. Almost nobody can reconstruct the actual chain of events that produce their current job, their current home, or their current friendships, and the inability to reconstruct it does not make any of those things less real. The practical form of this is small and repeatable. When the calculation starts, the correction is not to argue with it or to suppress it. It is to return to the finished state, which has no route in it, and to allow the question of how to remain unanswered. Leaving a question unanswered is uncomfortable for about a week and then stops being uncomfortable, and it costs nothing, which is more than can be said for answering it 8 times a night. The sentence you repeat without hearing it. Everything in this video converges on one small practical exercise, and it is not the night practice. It is something that happens during the day, and it is where almost all of the leverage sits. Nearly everyone carries a small number of sentences about themselves that they have said so many times that the sentences no longer register as statements. They have become furniture. They get said in passing, usually in a self-deprecating tone, usually to be agreeable, and they are never examined, because examining them would be a strange thing to do about something so obviously true. Money is always tight for me. I am terrible with that sort of thing. It never works out for people like me. I always end up doing this. That is just my luck. Nothing ever changes here. Consider what those sentences are on Goddard's account. They are assumptions, in his precise sense. They are not being wished for, not being worked at, not being repeated on a schedule with any effort. They are simply taken as the case, restated in ordinary conversation, without the slightest emotional charge, and never reopened. They have every property he identified as necessary. They are held as fact, they are persisted in without strain, and they are never relitigated. Which means the person saying them is not somebody who cannot do this. They are somebody who is already extremely good at it, working continuously and without effort in a direction they did not choose. That reframing is worth more than any technique in this video, and it is offered for a specific reason. A tired person listening to material like this usually believes the problem is that they cannot manage the practice. The likelier situation is that they have been running a successful practice for years on a sentence they picked up somewhere in their 20s and never inspected. The work that follows is not effortful, but it is uncomfortable, because it requires listening to oneself for a few days with the attention a person would give to a stranger. The instruction is only to notice which sentences get said without being heard. Which of them arrived from a relative? Which of them were true once, about a situation that has since ended, and have simply never been withdrawn? A worked illustration, offered as an illustration. What follows is constructed for teaching purposes, and it is being flagged as constructed before it begins. It is not a case from Goddard's record, it is not attributed to him, and it is not offered as evidence of anything. It exists only to show the shape of the distinction this video has been drawing. Take two people in identical external circumstances. Both need a substantial sum within a few months. Both have the same income, the same obligations, and the same absence of an obvious route. Both have encountered this material and both intend to apply it. The first one applies it as effort. They set a nightly appointment. They construct a detailed scene and hold it for 20 minutes with concentration. They keep a record of whether the scene felt convincing. During the day, they check their situation for movement, and finding none, they conclude the evening work was not vivid enough, so they extend it and add a morning session. Their inner conversations are about the practice. Is it working? Was last night better than the night before? Why is nothing happening? Within 3 weeks, the practice has become the largest single source of anxiety in their life, and the interior commentary underneath it has been a continuous, high-quality account of absence. The second one applies it as attention. They do not schedule anything. As they get into bed, they take one short scene, implying the matter is already settled, something small enough to be dull, and they let it run a few times as they go under. It takes perhaps 4 minutes, and some nights it takes 1. They do not record anything, and they do not evaluate it. During the day, when the calculation starts, they notice it, decline to complete it, and return to the settled state, which takes a second. When somebody asks how things are going, they do not narrate the shortage. The point of the illustration is not that the second person is guaranteed anything, and no such guarantee is being offered here. The point is that only one of these two people is going to be tired, and that the tiredness belongs entirely to the practice built on effort, which is not the practice the record describes. The Search and Resurrection on Ending Struggle. 2 of the 12 books are worth naming here for what their titles alone establish about the arc of his thinking, and both are usually skipped in favor of the famous ones. The Search appeared in 1946, early, 7 years after the first book. Resurrection appeared in 1966, and it is the last of the 12. Between them lies the whole of his recorded lecture period, and effectively the whole of his public working life. There is something worth noticing in the fact that the early book is called The Search, and the final one is not. Searching is the posture this entire video has been describing under the name chasing. It is the position of a person standing at a distance from something and looking for the way across. And whatever else can be said about the last book, it is not named for a search. Resurrection names something completed and returned rather than something looked for. That observation is being offered as an observation about titles, not as a claim about the contents of 2 books. This video is not quoting, and the distinction between those 2 things is exactly the sort of distinction this channel would rather draw out loud than blur. What can be said with more confidence is about the shape of the career, since that is a matter of dates rather than of pages. His early period is practical and instructional. His later period, from roughly 1961 onwards, is increasingly concerned with the promise, with the mystical experience, and with material that is not about improving anybody's circumstances at all. He never withdrew the practical teaching. He was still giving it in the same years. But the center of gravity moved. The relevance to a tired listener is modest but real. A man spent 30 years teaching a method for changing circumstances in front of audiences who came back repeatedly, and by the end of it, his own attention had moved to something else that he did not describe as an achievement and did not offer as a technique. That is not a reason to dismiss the practical material. It is a reason to hold it at a sensible size. It was never presented, by him, as the answer to a life. Objections that deserve a real answer. Anything worth taking seriously can be argued with, and a video that never states the objections is not treating its listener as an adult. Here are the strongest ones, with the honest answers rather than the reassuring ones. The first objection is that this is unfalsifiable. If the thing arrives, the method worked. If it does not, the person was checking, or doubting, or narrating absence during the day. Nothing could count against it. That objection is correct as stated, and it should be conceded rather than deflected. This material is not a scientific claim and does not have the structure of one. The most that can honestly be said is that the practice is cheap, takes minutes a night that are already being spent, and is being described here accurately rather than sold. The second objection is that survivorship shapes the entire evidence base. The accounts that circulate are the accounts of people for whom something arrived. Nobody collects, publishes, or repeats the accounts of the people who practiced faithfully for 2 years and saw nothing, and there is no reason to think that group is small. That objection is also correct, and there is no answer to it that is both honest and comforting. The third objection is the moral one, and it is the one that matters most. A teaching which says that circumstances express an occupied state can very easily be turned into a claim that people in difficulty have produced their own difficulty. Applied to somebody else, that is cruelty wearing the clothes of a principle, and this channel has already refused it once in this video and refuses it again here. Nothing in the surviving record supports using this material as an explanation of anyone's life except one's own. The fourth objection is the practical one. Some situations require action, and immediately. A person with a real deadline, real obligations, or real danger needs to do things in the world, and any teaching that discourages them from doing so is not merely wrong but harmful. That objection is correct, and Goddard's material does not conflict with it. Nothing here has asked anybody to stop acting. What has been described is what to stop narrating, which is a different thing entirely and takes nothing away from the day. Where rest becomes neglect and stops working. There is a failure mode built into the register of this video's title, and it would be dishonest to describe a teaching about rest without naming it. The word rest is doing precise work in this material, and it is not a synonym for withdrawal. Rest in the assumption means resting from the interior effort of monitoring, calculating, and restating a lack. It does not mean resting from a person's obligations, their relationships, their work, or their responsibilities to other people. Those are not the mechanism and never were, and stopping them does not advance anything. The distinction is easy to state and easy to lose in practice, so it is worth putting concretely. Somebody who stops mentally rehearsing how the money will arrive and who continues to do their job is applying the teaching. Somebody who stops doing their job because they have decided the route is not their department has misread it, and the misreading is not supported by anything Goddard verifiably taught. There is nothing in the record that asks a person to withdraw from their own life, and a good deal in it that assumes they will not. There is a second and quieter failure mode worth naming. The teaching can become a way of not looking at something. A person can use nightly practice as a substitute for a conversation they need to have, a decision they have been postponing, or a problem that requires ordinary attention. When that happens, the practice is functioning as avoidance, and the tiredness usually gets worse rather than better, because the avoided thing keeps generating exactly the interior traffic the practice is supposed to end. The honest test for both failure modes is the same, and it takes about 10 seconds. Is this reducing the amount of interior narration about a lack, or is it reducing the amount of contact with a person's actual life? The first is the teaching. The second is not, and this video would rather say so than let a restful title carry an implication it cannot support. And a final limit, stated because a listener who is tired deserves it rather than because it is comfortable. Nothing in this material is a treatment for anything. Nothing here is advice about a person's health or their finances, and no promise is being made about what will happen to anybody who applies it. What has been described is what a man taught, as accurately as the surviving record permits. something quieter to take into sleep. So, the practical residue of 90 minutes, gathered into the smallest form it will take, since the whole argument of this video has been that the form should be small. Nothing in what follows is an addition to a day. Every part of it happens in minutes that are already being spent, mostly on the review that runs at the edge of sleep and on the calculation that runs during it. First, during the day, and this is the part that carries most of the weight. Notice the sentences that get said without being heard. Not all of them, and not with any rigor. Just enough to know which ones are there. A sentence that has been running unexamined for 15 years is an assumption held with perfect persistence, which means the capacity for this was never in question. Second, when the calculation about the root begins, and it will begin, do not argue with it. Arguing with it is more interior traffic. Simply decline to complete it, and let the question of how remain open. That is not resignation. It is the refusal of a task that was never assigned. Third, at night, in the interval that arrives, whether anybody arranges it or not, take one short scene or one short sentence implying the thing is already settled, small enough to be dull, a door being closed, a quiet remark somebody would make afterwards. Let it repeat itself loosely, the way a tune does when a person is half asleep, and then let it go. If it is still being supervised, it has become effort again, and effort is the thing this whole teaching removes. And that is the whole instruction, which is where this video began. More than 3 decades of public teaching, 12 books published across 27 years, more than 2 decades of recorded lectures, and the practice at the center of it never got any longer, never acquired stages, and never required anybody to summon anything. For a person who is tired of trying, that flatness in the record is not a curiosity. It is the finding. Whatever Neville Goddard was right or wrong about, he was not describing something that has to be earned by exhaustion, and he never once suggested that the people who wanted it hardest were the ones who got it. He put the whole thing in the last few minutes of an ordinary night, where the tired already are.